I am the director of the Gender and Public Policy Specialization at SIPA. I'm a lawyer and a sociologist, and I have been working on issues regarding gender rights, I would say conservatively, for most of my relatively long career. I've worked on these issues from a variety of perspectives as a scholar, as a teacher, as an academic, as an advocate, and also as a consultant on policy issues to multiple organizations, both international and also national. And so you could say that I have a strong commitment to questions of gender rights and to gender equality. And frankly, that really is one of the trajectories through which people come to the study of gender, which is that you find in your own experiences events or processes that show you how gender has shaped your own life chances and those of the people around you whom you care about. Many people come because gender is really a personal issue for them, and they understand that it's not just a personal individual issue, but that it's a personal issue that is related to very deep and important and structural social processes. Many people also come to the specialization and I would say come to work on gender issues, not having thought that they would start there at all. And that's because they encounter gender issues in their work. So I'm thinking of alumni of SIPA who have become amongst our most staunch supporters, whom we work with regularly in workshops and in other ways, who never studied gender when they were at SIPA, but in whose work as, let's say, development economists or in human rights or in other spheres, including in security and even in finance, have come to realize the importance of gender for policy making in general. And so there are many trajectories to come to look at the relationship between gender and public policy. And I'm delighted that there are so many different ways of approaching this issue. And it's part of the richness of the conversations that we can have. Sometimes when you say gender and global affairs, people look somewhat quizzically, sort of like, really? And that's because I think they think of gender as an issue that is very individual, that to the extent to which it is related to public policy, it's related to the policies of particular nation states, of the countries in which they live, that it's a very domestic question. But let me give you a few examples of things that are going on right now that have global significance, and then we'll talk about them. One is in the International Court of Justice. In the last year, the country of the Gambia has brought a suit against the country of Myanmar over complaining of Myanmar's perpetration of genocide against the Rohingya population. So just have that in mind first. Second, at the moment, and as often happens, the Security Council will be debating a resolution that regards peace and security. It does so in the context, it is specifically a resolution, actually, as there have been many others, on women, peace, and security. Third, in virtually every country, there are intense debates today that ought to be internationally coordinated, probably much more than they in fact are, over how we ought to address the pandemic, how we can address the pandemic, and not only in the short term, as a medical emergency, a health crisis today, but also in the long term, in terms of when, as we hope, the medical aspects of the pandemic have been brought under control, we will still be needing to address all of its socioeconomic consequences, of which there will be a great many. And finally, let me remind you that even as we're all caught up in the pandemic, and even as there are so many issues on the international agenda at the moment, but the international community has a long-standing commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals. Each of these examples that I have given you, excuse me, I have to just drink some water. Sorry, is centrally to do with gender. So genocide and the case against genocide revolves in part against the rapes and the attempts to exterminate, or the putative attempt to exterminate the Rohingya population in whole or in part. That's the term of the Genocide Convention, including through the prevention of births. And that is fundamentally to do with the use of rape, sterilizations, and other means to prevent the reproduction of the Rohingya population. Other policies also implemented by the state of Myanmar can be said to be related to the general objective of attempting to limit Rohingya births in Myanmar. I'm not saying that these accusations have been proven, the case is pending in front of the court. What I want you to think about is that these are issues that are today before the International Court of Justice. Similarly, we have today a debate and an ongoing, and we actually have at the moment a month long of events at the United Nations on the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. Now, the United Nations, and in particular the Security Council, is probably the apex organization of security issues in the world. What it deals with is, by definition, a question of global politics. And at the moment, it's dealing with the issues that are explicitly related to gender. Similarly, the Sustainable Development Goals that I mentioned a moment ago are permeated by questions relating to gender. First of all, there is a standalone goal in itself, which is about the promotion of gender equality as a per se goal. In other words, when countries committed to adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, they, amongst other things, committed themselves to the promotion of gender equality. But not only that, when the Sustainable Development Goals were approved, there was a clear understanding, debated, contested, but nonetheless an understanding that has subsequently been reinforced many times, including by the Secretary General, that the achievement of each and any one of those goals depends on pushing forward gender equality and has important gender ramifications. And finally, how to address COVID. Addressing COVID is, of course, in the first instance, a health issue and requires health-related policies. To that extent, it has mobilized the global health workforce, of which perhaps about 70% is female. That 70% is distributed in ways that are unequal within the healthcare professions, but exposure to infection has actually more or less paralleled participation in in other words, if approximately 70% of healthcare workers are female and are involved in dealing with COVID, a somewhat analogous figure is that of the healthcare workers who have become infected with COVID. So there are questions of gender that cut through how we address COVID as a healthcare matter. Who do we mobilize? Who is on the front lines? What about the home front? How is illness being dealt with within homes? Who is getting, yes, we say isolation, quarantine. We know that different populations have different capacities to impose isolation and all the other measures. And they have also differential rates of exposure to the illness and perhaps different susceptibilities to becoming ill. But it's also the case that even in isolation, a sick person requires care. And who is it who's going to provide that care? And what are the factors that are actually organizing the distribution of care? This is an important question. There are also, of course, all of the consequences from policies that go from, for example, the closure of schools and the burdens of housework to the closing down of labor markets, to simply unemployment. And we again know that the consequences of all these things are gendered. When it comes to trying to address these consequences, of course, there are many things that have to be done right now, but the price of the policies that are being implemented is unevenly distributed. It's unevenly distributed on intersectional grounds, in terms of minorities, in terms of classes, social class, in terms of economic possibilities, and it's unevenly distributed in terms of gender. And so, when it comes to the time to think about international guidance for policies to try to correct these distorting impacts, they will have to be formulated, bearing in mind gender relations. So what's striking is, when you think about, for example, the case against the Myanmar that the Gambia has brought in the ICJ, is that after the Second World War and in the Nuremberg trials, there were no trials for rape. There were a few trials in the Tokyo Tribunal, and they were really marginal. Gender and gender-related crimes, sex-related crimes, were just not part of the canon of what was considered in those trials. And yet, today, a major institution, the International Court of Justice, also known sometimes as the World Court, which is the place where states sue each other for compliance over their compliance or lack of compliance with their international legal obligations, addresses genocide in part also as a matter of gender-related crimes. When the Millennium Development Goals were approved prior to the Sustainable Development Goals, they had passing references to gender. Yes, there was a goal that had to do with gender, but it was very limited and not considered central to the entire effort. 15 years later, the Sustainable Development Goals have a very different cast. And as for, just to take another example, the Security Council would not have debated gendered issues. It launched the Women, Peace and Security agenda, was launched exactly 20 years ago. But prior to that, rape was considered an incident of war, an unfortunate fact that happened when there was conflict, not a fact that had any real significance from the point of view of international peace and security, and therefore any claim on the attention of such an important body as the Security Council. And as for COVID, I strongly hope, but I also think that when governments are going to be discussing individually or with international organizations and international settings, the kinds of post-COVID policies that they will implement, they will hopefully also bear in mind analyses that go under the general rubric of gender-sensitive budgeting and a series of other techniques that we today have that allow you to evaluate the differential impact of policies by gender. In other words, part of the accountability mechanisms, as well as the planning mechanisms, will regard, I hope, gender. So it's impossible to say that gender is only a peripheral issue in relation to global affairs. And equally, it's impossible to say that global affairs are marginal when it comes to structuring gender relations and therefore individuals' life chances on gendered lines. And that's the nexus. But how did we get there? How is it that in fact, in a relatively short span of time, it's been a long time since the Nuremberg trials, but it's been a short time, really, since the first definition of the Millennium Development Goals. And yet throughout that entire period, change has been occurring and gender has become, has assumed a greater role and greater importance, I would say, in the international stage. So where did we start? And Kathleen, if you could show the first slide, please. Hello? Okay. So this is one of my favorite pictures, partly because I think it's a wonderful starting point. Of course, there are many potential starting points. When do we start talking about women and gender affairs and gender in global affairs? And in fact, that happens much earlier than the moment that this picture depicts. When the International Labour Organization was founded in 1919, to give you an example, one of the first resolutions that it passed had to do with maternity leave. But nonetheless, as a major question, as a major sort of institutional moment, on the left, you have the first meeting of the Commission on the Status of Women, which is a commission of the United Nations that it was for a very long time, the most important entity in the United Nations addressing questions of women's rights in particular. And this is a partial photograph of the 15-member commission in 1947 at its first post-war meeting. Who is sitting on the right? And if I could hear your answers, I'm sure you would notice some of the differences between what you see on the left and what you see on the right. And on the right, what you're looking at is the Economic and Social Council. If I were to ask you who reports to whom in this structure, the Economic and Social Council is also a structure of the United Nations, one of its important policy-making structures. Who reports to whom? I think you would know that answer instinctively, and you would be right. It is, of course, the Commission on the Status of Women, an institution purely of women, that answers to, that is empowered by, but answers to the Economic and Social Council, an institution which in 1948 looks as though it's entirely made of men. And yet, today the picture would look very different. And can you show the next slide, please, Kathleen? All right. this is a photograph of the Beijing Conference on Women, whose 25th anniversary we're celebrating this year. And as you can see, the look and feel of the conference is already extremely different. It still is primarily actually activated by women, and they are its protagonists. Where we stand today, and Kathleen, could we have the next slide, please? All right, is institutionally, sociologically, and normatively extremely different from the place where we started, I would say 70 years ago. What I've got up here on the screen are some of the social effects of changes in the last 20 years, where we can see actually real improvements in the conditions of women. And so what I want to point your attention to here is the drop. Actually, that 113 is in the wrong column. It should be 2000. 113 per 100,000 live births in 2000, which declined to 59 in 2017. Still way too high and very unevenly distributed. Much higher in some countries, especially in countries in sub-Saharan Africa, but rising in other countries, including in the United States. Not a problem that we have been able to solve satisfactorily. And yet, significant improvement has been made, as has been made in many of the other indicators that you will see in front of you. The Beijing conference that I showed you earlier, can we just go back to that picture, please? Kathleen, thank you. The Beijing conference was a turning point in the international politics of, in the global politics of gender equality, especially and in particular, if viewed from the perspective of women's rights. Although it addressed insufficiently other issues of gender rights, and in particular with reference to LGBT issues, it certainly did not pay the attention that it might have done to those. But from a specific perspective of women's rights, the Beijing conference marked a real turning point. And it set the parameters, the general framework for policy that would continue to guide governments and that would continue also to focus dissent for the subsequent quarter of a century. Amongst the things that the Beijing conference did was it established a close nexus between the improvement of women's conditions and the specific concept of women's rights. In other words, that there was a right or a set of rights, obligations that states had to fulfill, not merely goals, but actual obligations that states had to fulfill, and that regarded women's access to equality. It was in fact in Beijing that Hillary Clinton launched her famous slogan, which in fact, what she was launching was a slogan that had circulated for a number of years within the women's movement. Women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights. It's not that all the countries present at Beijing agreed necessarily wholeheartedly, but it was recognized as, that slogan was really recognized as setting a general understanding of the direction in which we ought to be moving. But Beijing identified specific objectives for a whole variety of sectors, employment, health, and so on and so forth. But it did much more than that. First of all, it said something which is fundamental and which always needs to be said and resaid. And that is that achieving women's equality is not a question of just adding women to the mix, and even less so if you think of adding gender and stirring, but rather that it requires profound structural transformations of societies. And so in Beijing, the agreement was that governments had to commit to profoundly reorganizing their societies around principles of gender equality. And that this had to be, in a way, if you want, a whole of society effort and a whole of the global community effort. And so Beijing said, this is a commitment on the part of governments, but it is also a commitment in which other actors are going to have to be involved. And so, first of all, international organizations. It can't just be an effort of individual countries, each acting on its own. It's a commitment to establishing within governments the structures that will allow the governments to monitor and implement policies that will promote women's equality. And therefore, the third partner is going to be civil society organizations. And the understanding was that those civil society organizations were going to be the organizations of women that came out of the women's movement and that were a very active voice during the Beijing conference. Let me take a step back for a second because I don't think I've explained the conference itself, and I apologize for that. But the conference was the fourth of a series of conferences organized by the United Nations beginning in 1970 that really reflected the push of the feminist movements that had emerged in many different countries at that point. And it was intended to address problems of relating specifically to women and to help formulate trajectories for change. So it was an international effort. It was launched by, it occurred under the aegis of the United Nations. It was its principal protagonists, or its principal official protagonists, were governmental delegations, including the delegation from the United States, which at that point Hillary Clinton led. But there was a huge influx of participants from civil society organizations who had a conference on the side of the Beijing, of the official conference. In fact, I believe starting a few days earlier. And there was a direct and symbiotic, if often also highly contentious, relationship between the informal and huge meeting of the civil society organizations and the official meetings themselves. So the Beijing platform, in a way, recognized exactly that. It said, civil society organizations have been a key part to promoting women's equality, and they need to be a key part to the formulation, implementation of policies that will address questions of women's equality, and also to continue, this continued mobilization is fundamental to ensuring that these policies actually are realized. That framework is the framework that has primarily guided, I would say, policy making, certainly in the international organizations for the last, since Beijing, and also been taken as at least an inspiration by many governments. It has always been extremely contentious, but it held. It really did hold. Today, we mark, as I was saying earlier, great advances. And so the idea that women's issues and gender rights and questions of women's rights should be debated within the central institutions of global governments, such as the Security Council, is contested, but fundamentally not contestable. The question today is it a question of rights, or as some countries would rather say, it's a question of development, of goals, not of obligations? And we'll talk about that in a second. And so we've made great progress. And Kathleen, if you could just show the fourth slide, please. Fourth, yeah. We've made great progress, but we haven't made enough progress. And so there would seem to be no reason to be trying to curtail the agenda. And what you see here in front of you are the Sustainable Development Goals and the Gender Index. To what extent has gender equality been achieved or to what extent is gender equality reflected in the realization of each one of these goals? And as you can see, that's not true for any goal. So we do better on hunger and nutrition, and we do far worse on partnerships, but the global index score is still pretty low. Now, obviously, individual countries will have different profiles. But my point is, this is a work in progress. This is a work that should be allowed to progress. And yet, we face and we have faced for a number of years, perhaps the strongest backlash against gender rights that has been seen, well, certainly an extremely strong backlash against gender rights. We could say it's not really a backlash. What it is in fact the promotion of an alternative vision in which gender equality just does not figure. And it certainly doesn't figure in the terms of much of the Beijing Platform for Action, which has been such an important part of guiding public policy and public policy debates in global public policy and global public policy debates. This backlash has been very forcefully felt. It has percolated up for a number of years, but it has been very, very forcefully felt in the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years. I'm sorry to say that amongst the countries that have taken a lead in the backlash is also the United States. But it's certainly not only an American effort. And that backlash targets certain things. It targets the notion of rights, the connection between women's rights, gender equality, or let's put it differently, the idea that the achievement of gender equality is in fact a question of rights and therefore a question of law and therefore a question of obligation on the part of states. It has been accompanied by, for some countries, but not for all, but for some countries, a singular focus on questions of sexual and reproductive health and rights, such that, for instance, last year, when the United States and other countries were debating in the Security Council another resolution on women, peace, and security, amongst others, the United States insisted on the elimination of all references to sexual and reproductive health. It has also been accompanied by a massive critique and I would say really an embargo on the term gender itself. So the term gender has been by some countries systematically substituted for by a direct reference only to women and men, or women and girls, men and boys, but everybody in their identity fixed and as determined the day we were born. It has also been accompanied by a pretty widespread attempt to, or implementation of policies to dismantle the gender equality machineries, so-called gender equality machineries that had been established largely after Beijing. What do I mean by machineries? I mean, as I said earlier, the institutions within governments that were created to monitor the development and the implementation of policies that would promote gender equality. In several countries, those institutions have either been entirely dismantled or just drowned in other institutions such as ministries of the family, very often having to do with the family. It's of course true that there's a connection between gender equality and the family, and in particular, if you like, women's gender equality generally, and the family, and women's equality and the family. But it's also equally true that A, not everybody in families has exactly the same interests, and B, that gender equality is far broader than the question of the particular organization of families in a particular society. So the dismantlement or the submersion of institutions specifically deputized to monitor women's rights or gender rights more generally is a way of reducing their importance and erasing or leveling out a fundamental part of their mandates. And finally, it has been accompanied by, and this has been especially evident in the large-scale meetings of the United Nations that generally happen in March around the annual meeting of the Commission on the Status of Women. This year they couldn't happen, but that's when they normally happen, and thousands of people come to those. So in those meetings, thousands of people come. They are both representatives of governments and also representatives of NGOs and civil society from around the world. What has happened in the last several years are two things. One, that within the discussions on women's rights, the voices wanting to articulate positions, and it's perfectly legitimate that they should do so, are not only the traditional organizations that promote the kinds of understandings of gender equality that were encoded in the Beijing platform, but also organizations that claim the terrain of women's rights or the terrain of human rights very often in relation to the right to life, but not only, in order to contest the Beijing platform for action and any of its derivatives. So what has happened is a marginalization of civil society organizations that were the third pillar of the Beijing platform, and a elevation of far more conservative voices on the question of gender equality. Now, I don't want to, although you may guess where my sympathies lie, I don't want to be promoting any particular view. What I will say is that the success of Beijing and of all of the mobilizations that came after, and the capacity of women's rights activists to work closely with international institutions then meant that new fora were created within which the actual interpretation of women's rights could be contested, and the institutional structure renegotiated and renegotiated. Those are institutional structures that are key to global governance. We have institutions like UN Women. We have the Commission on the Status of Women. We have debates in the Security Council. We have gender rights being considered in virtually every single United Nations agency. There's no cause for triumphalism in this, but what there is a recognition of the fact that gender has clearly become a central issue in global affairs. Thank you. So I think if you have questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you so much for that talk. I was completely shocked at some things that I just learned, and I think a lot of people also have some interesting questions. I found that we have a few questions that came in actually, so I think we have time to take a few. We have a question from Oriola. She asked, what is the difference between gender matters in politics and gender matters in affairs, national and international?
So what's the difference between gender matters in politics?
Politics and gender matters when it comes to in affairs of national and international affairs.
Well, I mean, I think that there's a close connection. I would say that when I think about these issues, I think about the connection between politics and policy, and also about the connection between policies and politics. And so something that I sort of was hinting at the end of my remarks, but that would be spelled out more in, for example, a discussion in a political science course, or really in a politics of policymaking course, is the fact that the institutions of policymaking promote certain kinds of politics. So when you have fora, like, for example, the Commission on the Status of Women, just to give one example, right? It becomes a center for a debate over what actually are women's rights, and and because the objective has been defined as the promotion of women's rights, then the debate is, what are those rights and who has a right, who has the capacity to interpret them? Now, that is simultaneously a question of politics, but also a question of policy making. And in the policy making, I would say that the legal and the rights framework should have an important place. So, for example, most countries of the world, not including the United States, have ratified the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. When we have policy making, it should correspond to the standards of a convention that governments have obligated themselves to respect. And they ought to be thinking about those obligations, not only when they're walking the halls of the United Nations, but when they're walking the halls, or when the Minister of Finance addresses the parliament of his country and says, COVID has imposed an austerity budget, and guess what? We're going to cut a whole range of support services for families, which, guess what? It means that the burden of care on women is going to be hugely increased. That Minister of Finance, she or he, as the case may be, needs to take into account the commitments that their country made under CEDAW. So that would be my answer. There's a direct nexus, but they're of course not conflatable as the same thing.
So we have a few questions. I'm trying to combine them, but a lot of people are asking, as we approach the 20th anniversary of the UN SDR 1325, One, what do you think are the largest barriers for progress for the agenda, and how effective do you think the Council has been for recentering women in peace and security?
So I think that the greatest obstacles at the moment is that there really is a tense negotiation that concerns whether issues of protecting women, recognizing their agency, and giving them really promoting women's roles in peacemaking. So one thing that we know, for example, right? We know that peace accords often fail. We also know that they will fail less often and less hard if they involve women. But an abysmally low number of peace accords actually does involve women. Okay. So the question is, what's the correct framework for addressing this issue? What's the correct framework for addressing sexual violence and conflict? What, for example, about the rights to access to reproductive health services for all people who suffer sexual violence and conflict, including potentially contraception and abortion? Is that a question of rights? Or is it a question of discretionary measures that countries may or may not decide that they want to promote? There's a huge discussion today over the framework. Is it rights? Are we talking rights? Or are we talking quantitative policy goals? That's one issue. Secondly, I think that the agenda that has developed over the years is for women, peace, and security, that the record is a normatively good record. I think that the implementation record is not. And I think that there's pretty widespread agreement amongst advocates for gender equality, and also including many scholars, that we don't need new resolutions. Thank you very much. Every time we have a new resolution, we have the risk of an enormous pushback. What we need is for countries to make good on their commitments. We need now to be able to develop the means to enforce implementation, or at least to promote it. So you can't feel good coming out of the Security Council because you've passed another resolution. You've got to feel good going to the Security Council and saying, here's my report on everything that I've achieved. And that, I think, is the real challenge of the moment.
Thank you. So we also had a few questions regarding gender inclusivity. How do we move forward with gender equality, which is inclusive of other genders?
Oh, I think that that's a really fundamental question. I'm very glad. I mean, all the questions have been really wonderful. But let me just say that this is something that I worry about, not that in such a short time I wasn't really able to address it. First, let me say, we have a program on gender. We don't have, it's not called the Women's Equality Specialization at CEPA. It's called the Gender and Public Policy Specialization. And that's because we recognize that gender is not just about women. Gender is really a fundamental dimension, an organizing principle of every society. It affects everybody's life chances, and it affects them no matter where you are and how you situate yourself on what I think of as the gender spectrum. It affects people very differently, depending on where they are on that gender spectrum. So I think gender inclusivity is essential because it's about the elimination of gender privilege, fundamentally. It's about the elimination of gender privilege, so that there are only certain kinds of interpretations, ways of being gendered, that have social validation. And I think that an inclusive politics is a politics that does away, that hammers away at those kinds of exclusionary and discriminatory measures. Secondly, it's about something else. It's not just simply about providing access to differently situated individuals on the gender spectrum, people who situate themselves differently on the spectrum of gender, possible gender identities, to those rights that are, let's say, the strong rights. So, for example, we had the campaign for marriage equality, or we have campaigns for the recognition of the fact that LGBT discrimination ought to be banned. We have a treaty on women's rights. We don't have a treaty that addresses LGBT plus rights in the same way. And frankly, I think most advocates think that today we can't possibly get one. But we need to be able to provide all of the same protections. That being said, when people can express their own views about their own ways of being on a gendered spectrum, I think that existing rights come to be redefined. That maybe the panoply of rights that we offer today is not sufficient, but maybe off base. So, for example, supporting gender change, sex change in particular, but policies to recognize gender identity change. I just taught a segment actually with the participation of advocates on the huge problem of the recognition of trans identity, a segment of my course on gender, globalization, and human rights. That's an issue that needs to be addressed. And it's an issue that actually needs to be addressed internationally, because you have to be able to carry your gender identity with you wherever you are. So that's what I would say about that. Sorry if I've been long-winded, but I really care about that.
No, I mean, it truly is something that we can't really do justice in talking about it for just 1 hour. And of course, we have so many questions, and unfortunately, we can't get to all of them. But for the last question, I think someone had asked, which I think is a good question to leave off on. What do you think is the future of gender policy?
Well, in one word, I think it's contentious. So I work very hard so a lot of my work has been on reproductive issues. But in the past several years, I've worked very hard and intensely on trying to understand what's known as the pushback against gender rights, and trying to understand how we can support a pushback against the pushback. The Secretary General of the United Nations, actually alarmed by the strength and the virulence of the pushback against gender rights, called for a pushback against the pushback. I think that's the frontier. I would say that I'm hopeful that we will get changes in geopolitics that will make the situation easier. But there are many, many, many things that will be contested, because gender speaks to such a fundamental issue in people's lives. This is really, it feels almost sacrilegious or wrong to make an analogy. But when you start talking about rearranging gender relations, that's much more profound than any taxation policy will ever be. It may have implications for taxation policy, and you should be thinking about those if you're interested in gender policies. But the issue of gender is much deeper, and it goes to how people feel about themselves. And so you have to be prepared to listen, for respectful conversations, and for engagement, to just stay engaged.